Welcome back, fellow listener. It seems it's your lucky night. I've just stumbled on a faint broadcast, you see, quiet voices crackling through the static. 5 people out on farmland at an hour when no one should be roaming. They're whispering about an old children's show set, something left behind, drowned under muddy water. A porch light flickers at the nearby farmhouse, and there's talk of a landowner who doesn't appreciate trespassers. I don't have all the details. I'm just eavesdropping, same as you, but the tension in their voices says they're about to slip into that pond, dive gear clinking, nerves on edge. And if the rumors are true, something long forgotten waits below, and not everyone wants it found. So lean in close if you dare. Together, we'll see what happens when 5 restless souls test the boundary between faded memories and hidden truths, in a place that might not be so abandoned after all.
They arrived shortly after midnight, 5 figures slipping out of an old van and onto a dirt track slick with recent rain. The sky above offered little light. A haze of cloud blotted out the moon, leaving the world around them a vague wash of shifting grey shapes. Somewhere in the distance, a single porch lamp burned at the farmhouse, a pinprick against the darkness. If there was any truth to the rumors, the man who lived there wouldn't hesitate to run them off his land, and nobody doubted he'd be armed too. They moved in a tight formation across the field, hunched low to avoid silhouettes against the horizon. A wind rattled the dried stalks of last season's corn and hissed through the tall grass. Richard led the way, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. He said little, but his posture made it clear he had no intention of retreating. The stories he'd gathered, fragmented forum posts, half-hidden blog entries, pointed to this unremarkable pond as the filming site of a once-popular children's show. Others knew of it, but no one had dared a proper dive to see what lingered below the waterline. Georgina, clutching a phone set to a faint glow, documented their progress with careful taps on the screen. She was the one who would be making the video, proof that they'd been the first in decades to see what remained of the set. Some earlier rumors mentioned local kids poking around, but if so, no evidence ever surfaced. Certainly no one had gone beneath the water. She'd spent weeks researching every rumor about the flooding, about how an entire production's worth of props and structures were left behind when the land was abruptly abandoned. Anne followed close, the straps of her oxygen tank crisscrossing her back. Each footstep into the wet earth left a sucking sound that seemed to vanish the moment it occurred. She'd been on more dives than any of them, but even she showed a flicker of unease in the way she glanced toward the farmhouse. Yet the real pull was the possibility of exploring a site no one else had touched. She'd done marine wrecks, cave dives, but this was different. A piece of cultural history buried in the mud, rumored to carry some dark story no one could fully recall. Julian's breathing quickened every time the wind rustled the undergrowth. He'd joined the group recently, lured by the thrill of documenting abandoned places, but he couldn't shake the knot in his gut. The farmland silence felt oppressive. He kept to the group's center, letting Richard and Georgina take the lead while Anne busied herself with gear checks. Nobody had told him he had to come. He'd volunteered. Now the night's hush made his skin prickle with second thoughts. Tim, tasked with keeping watch, lagged behind them. He held a flashlight in one hand, though he kept it switched off, and a radio in the other, set to a shared channel. If the farmer decided to patrol, Tim was the one who'd warn the others to clear out. Rumor had it the farmer's father once leased the land to the production, then sold it off after the show ended for reasons unknown. Some said it was to hide an accident, others that there'd been trouble on set. Whatever the truth, Tim felt a prickle of paranoia with every step. He'd seen property owners chase out trespassers before, but the stories that seemed to swirl around this particular farm made him uneasy. By the time they reached the sagging chain-link fence, all conversation had died into low whispers. Rust flaked off the links under Richard's gloved hand, and he lifted a section for the others to duck beneath. Rainwater dripped from the battered wire, pattering on the sodden ground. On the other side, the slope led down to the pond, a perfect circle of stillness in the faint starlight. From a distance, it looked entirely mundane, even small. Close up, though, the water gave off an unsettling stillness, a mirror-like quality that swallowed what little light there was. Georgina panned her phone around, capturing the approach. "This has to be it," she whispered. "From the old production photos, the topography lines up, the shape of the land, the tree line. It's all here." Anne set her pack down and began checking her regulators. She spoke in quiet, measured tones, describing how they'd proceed in pairs. She'd lead first, with Julian as her buddy. Richard and Georgina would follow. Tim would stand guard. In the distance, the dim porch lamp remained steady, a beady eye in the darkness that could turn hostile in a heartbeat. They made their way to the pond's edge. The mud sucked at their boots, and a thin scum of algae brushed against their ankles. Julian knelt to test the water temperature with a gloved hand, grimacing at the cold that stung his fingertips. Richard cast a glance at the horizon, as if half expecting to see the flicker of a flashlight or the glow of a cigarette marking the farmer's approach. But there was only darkness and the faint whistle of wind. Anne was the first to slip into the water, an audible hiss escaping her lips at the chill. She moved slowly, mindful of every step. Even in the gloom, she could sense debris lurking below, broken boards or old cement footings. Waist deep, she pulled on her mask and flicked on a low-beam dive torch, revealing a murky swirl of sediment below the surface. Julian followed, muttering to himself for courage. He kept close to Anne, remembering her instructions about hand signals, about not wandering off. Georgina handed them a submersible camera rig, carefully sealed in a watertight housing. If anything still existed down there, fragments of the old set, children's show props half buried in silt, they meant to capture it on video. Richard watched them disappear into the water, tilting his head to listen for any approach across the field. The quiet pressed in, so complete that his own heartbeat sounded thunderous in his ears. He gave Georgina a nod, and she turned her phone's camera on him briefly, recording the moment as he prepared to slip into the pond. In the background, Tim stood at the fence, scanning the perimeter. No movement. No sound of boots through the grass. Not yet. The surface of the pond rippled with each entry, but soon stilled again, leaving only faint circles of disturbance that vanished in seconds. If not for a slight gleam of underwater torchlight, no one would guess 4 people were now beneath that cold water, drifting deeper toward what remained of a lost filming location. Allegedly, the place had been flooded shortly after the show ended, whether by design or by a more sinister motive, no one could confirm. There were stories about the production shutting down under bizarre circumstances, but official records only hinted at vague licensing issues and a sudden shift in ownership. Tim lingered at the edge, knuckles pale around the flashlight. He glanced anxiously between the farmhouse and the pond. If the farmer woke, they'd have minutes at best to scramble back to the van. A sudden crack from the fence made him jump, but it was just the wind, dislodging a loose piece of rusted wire. It jacked his pulse up regardless. He exhaled, tried to steady himself, and pressed the radio's transmit button in a quick, nervous pattern that served as their version of all clear. He waited for a response, his ear close to the speaker. Only faint static returned. Turning back to the water, Tim caught a glimpse of Georgina's torch beam flickering close to the pond floor. Then it was gone, replaced by gloom. Behind him, the farmhouse light remained steady, the only glow for miles in this vast, empty field. He couldn't decide which was more unnerving, the threat of a psychotic farmer with a loaded gun, or the silent darkness beneath that water, where a world of half-forgotten shapes waited for someone or something to disturb their long rest. A thin layer of algae drifted on the pond's surface, disturbed by the slow churn of bodies slipping steadily deeper. Underneath, the world became a murky twilight punctuated by beams of artificial light slicing the gloom. Anne led the way, her torch a narrow cone revealing swirling specks of silt and the dim outlines of submerged structures. She could feel the cold press against her wetsuit, each breath echoing in her regulator like a distant heartbeat. Julian stayed to her left, moving with a hesitance that bordered on clumsy. This wasn't his first time diving, but it was the first time in water that tasted of mud and rust. He kept one hand near the tangle of rope they'd brought, half expecting to snag it on something unseen. He tried to focus on Anne's steady progress, tried to mirror her calm. Yet with every pulse of the torchlight, he caught glimpses of shapes that set his mind racing, what might have been a sloping wall, or a broken railing, or some hulking set prop half devoured by silt. Several feet behind them, Richard and Georgina descended more slowly, checking each other's gear, passing brief hand signals that glowed faintly in the torchlight. Georgina held a submersible camera in front of her like a shield, her finger never straying far from the shutter button. Through the camera's viewfinder, the underwater realm looked even darker, a world of drifting sediment and half-formed shadows. She felt a pang of anxiety as she tried to orient herself. With no distinct landmarks, it was all too easy to lose direction. Then Anne's torch caught something, a curving structure jutting from the muck, large enough to dwarf them all. The light traced a broad arc of metal, discolored by algae and streaked with ribbons of rust. The battered doorway, partially collapsed, gaped like an open mouth. Julian hovered beside Anne, eyes wide behind his mask, as though mesmerized by the scale of it. Above water, Tim paced at the pond's edge, boots squelching in the mud. He could no longer see the faint glow of their torches flickering in the depths. The farmland was silent, except for an occasional gust of wind that set the fence rattling. He kept his radio in one hand, the flashlight in the other, scanning the horizon for any sign of the farmer's approach. The steady glow from the farmhouse window seemed to pulse in his peripheral vision, a reminder that they had no permission to be here. He found himself wishing for noise, anything to break the tension of waiting and not knowing. Every shift of darkness made him wonder if someone was watching him from the fields. Below, Richard and Georgina approached the dome from a different angle, mindful of the debris. A severed pipe stuck out like a jagged spear. Bits of plastic or foam drifted in slow motion with each current. Georgina couldn't shake the sense of intrusion. It felt like trespassing in a place not meant to be rediscovered. She aimed her camera at the dome's exterior, capturing the faint lines of what might have been bright paint once. Now it was pallid and streaked, as if the water had leached away every trace of color and cheer. Anne gestured for Julian to follow as she edged closer to what looked like a hatch or window. A sheen of silt covered the glass, making it impossible to see inside. With careful motions, she wiped a section clean, her flashlight revealing only murky blackness beyond. Yet something about that darkness felt occupied, as if the interior space had eyes looking back. She hesitated, then gave a quick shake of her head. Not worth the effort of forcing entry when there was so much else to explore first. A swirl of current ruffled the sediment beneath them, clouding the water. One by one, the beams of light flared with dancing grit. Julian felt his pulse spike. He caught the outline of a shape moving through the haze. It vanished almost as soon as he noticed it, leaving him unsure if it had been a trick of his own nerves. They continued around the perimeter. Pieces of mangled scaffolding littered the pond floor, and the fragmented hull of a smaller dome protruded at an odd angle. Richard signaled Georgina to film a series of markings on its curved side, letters or symbols scoured away by years underwater. The loops and lines were barely legible, more suggestions than real writing. Georgina's camera light gave them an eerie glow, as though they pulsed with some residual energy. She wondered if it was just her mind playing tricks, but her heart thudded harder nonetheless. Above them, Tim stopped pacing long enough to call into his radio. "Everything good down there? Talk to me." His voice was low but urgent. For a tense moment, only static crackled back at him, making him clench his jaw. Then Richard's voice came through, muffled by water and electronics. "All good. Just keep an eye out." Tim exhaled, lifting his gaze to the farmhouse on the ridge. The light there still hadn't changed, but that didn't soothe him. In some ways, its unwavering presence was worse. An unknown observer, sitting and waiting. Under the surface, Anne led them toward a collapsed archway. Algae trailed like ribbons from its edges. She inched forward, shining her torch into the gloom beneath the arch. Rust flakes and rotted fabric stirred up around her ankles. On the far side, the collapsed roof of another structure formed a half-tunnel. Georgina's camera captured the moment her flashlight beam revealed a corridor-like space, almost large enough to swim through. The group hesitated. There was a sense that once they went in, the darkness would swallow them entirely. Just then, a sudden tremor ran through the water, a subtle vibration they all felt. Julian's adrenaline spiked as though the floor of the pond had shifted. He whipped his head around, searching for the source, but saw only Anne's silhouette and the drifting debris. In the swirl of disturbed sediment, he lost sight of Richard and Georgina for a moment. A second later, their torches reappeared, bobbing a few yards away. Georgina motioned a question. Had they felt that? And Richard answered with a single nod. Without words, the four divers paused, letting the water settle. Tiny motes of dirt drifted past their lights like dust in a forgotten attic. In that quiet moment, each of them felt the weight of being in a place long forsaken, a man-made dreamscape turned silent graveyard beneath the waves. Every snap of shifting debris or faint echo of current seemed to carry the suggestion that they were not alone in this drowned world. Up above, Tim raked a hand through his hair, nerves ratcheting tight. The breeze had died, leaving the field ominously still. No footfalls, no voices from the farmhouse, but the hush carried its own menace. He glanced at his watch, then back to the silent pond. He started to wonder how long a dive like this should take, and how quickly he'd be able to signal if the farmer finally stepped outside, shotgun in hand. Down below, Anne turned away from the archway, guiding Julian back toward the dome's main structure. It was too risky to push further inside without a clearer sense of stability. Even so, as they moved, she kept her torch angled at the corridor, as though hoping to catch one more glimpse of it. Water swirled around her legs, and a dull thud reverberated somewhere in the distance, maybe a chunk of debris settling, or some other forgotten thing shifting in the dark. Beneath the pond's surface, the water felt colder than it had moments before, as if the deeper they ventured, the further they slipped from anything resembling normal. Anne noticed it first, a shift in temperature that made her exhale harder against her regulator. She paused mid-kick, blinking into the gloom, feeling the hush around them intensify. Julian drew up beside her, his eyes searching the half-lit shapes strewn across the silt. What they'd thought were just fallen beams and random debris were starting to resolve into something more deliberate. curved plastics, rusted metal frames, large sections of molded fiberglass, pieces that hinted at a once colourful landscape now cast in shades of greenish murk. Georgina hovered a few feet above, adjusting the camera angles, while Richard steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. The swirling silt made it challenging to capture anything clearly, but every so often the camera's light revealed an edge or contour that caught her breath. The bright corner of a child's plastic toy, half buried in sediment, or a small cluster of objects that might have been decorative furniture for an otherwise whimsical set. She caught glimpses of cartoonish shapes that were difficult to interpret under the algae and grime. A few yards away, Anne's torch beam slid across a large, toppled apparatus. She and Julian drifted closer, picking their way around sharp metal shards jutting from the pond floor. At first, it looked like some bizarre industrial machine, all mismatched tubing and paneling. Then Julian's light found a faint logo painted along its side, peeling pastel letters that suggested a child-friendly contraption. The lettering was nearly gone, but the top sported a kind of funnel, wide and round, caked with silt. It reminded them of a heavy-duty blending device or a soft-serve dispenser. It was the Tubby cream machine. Georgina had mentioned a rumor about a prop too large to move and left behind when the set flooded, something central to the show's theme. Now, here it was, scoured by time and choked with mud. A gentle current drifted past them, lifting silt and revealing the machine's lower half. Attached hoses lay tangled around the base like tentacles. Shining her torch, Anne could see that the casing had been ripped open, whether from the weight of debris collapsing or something more violent, it was impossible to say. A child's shoe lay next to it, the fabric tattered, the sole caked in algae. Julian froze when he saw it. The presence of something so small and personal amid the broken contraption, setting off a jolt of dread that coursed through him like an electric charge. Up on the bank, Tim's radio crackled again, pulling him from his restless scanning of the farmhouse. He lifted it to his ear. Faint voices, Richard's, maybe Georgina's, trying to maintain communication. It sounded like they'd found something, but the static made it impossible to pick out details. Tim glanced over his shoulder, half expecting a figure to appear at any moment among the rows of corn stubble. The farmhouse lamp still glowed, a solitary beacon in the otherwise pitch-black field. He felt the weight of the flashlight at his side, wishing he could be down there to see what the others were seeing, yet relieved he wasn't submerged in that silence. At least up here, he had open sky, even if it was starless and filled with the threat of the landowner's approach. Below, Richard guided Georgina closer to another structure. At first, it looked like a squat cylinder perched on wheels, lying on its side. But as they circled it, he realized it had a nozzle or hose-like extension at one end, cracked plastic, vaguely reminiscent of a vacuum or cleaning device. Georgina angled her camera, the light revealing an almost comical, tube-like snout. She mouthed a silent observation to Richard. This must have been the show's robotic vacuum, the rumored helper everyone had joked about on message boards. The eyes, once large and whimsical, were now chipped away, covered in cataracts of filmy algae, giving the machine a lifeless stare. Her camera panned across the silt at its base. Strewn amid the debris were small, bright items, a set of plastic blocks, a rubber ball with waterlogged patterns. Georgina could almost imagine children playing here once, or at least children visiting the set for a special day. The rumors of catastrophic events had always seemed exaggerated, yet this lonely, half-rotted detritus pointed to something abrupt and tragic. She steadied her breathing, telling herself it was only an abandoned filming location, nothing more. Anne and Julian rejoined them, guiding the beam of their torches across a series of battered walls. Faded outlines suggested a large interior space that must have formed some main hub for the show. She ran her fingers across a spongy patch where insulation had broken open, releasing tangles of decaying foam. Julian tugged at her arm and gestured toward a corner. The silt had receded just enough to reveal a line of small chairs, each painted in garish colors that had since washed out into pastel ghosts. One had a child's handprint pressed into its seat, the paint around it cracked and peeling. Anne felt her throat tighten with an unspoken sense of sorrow. A soft vibration again shuddered through the water, stirring loose bits of debris. Georgina tried to keep her camera steady. The group exchanged uneasy glances. It might have been more rubble shifting, but it felt too consistent, like a slow pulse. Richard signaled that they should move away from the walls, uncertain if the structure was collapsing further. None of them wanted to be trapped under a sudden shift of beams or panels. They drifted back out into a more open space. The dim silhouette of the custard machine loomed to their left, and to the right, the mechanical vacuum lay on its side, silent and rusted. Julian directed his torch downward and noticed a cluster of stuffed toys half hidden under a sheet of metal plating. He swam closer, kneeling in the silt. They were barely recognizable, lumps of fabric with bright patches here and there, maybe once shaped like friendly creatures. He gently lifted one, noticing a plastic eye still clinging to the tattered cloth. It dangled from a thread. The rest of its face was gone, as though eaten away by time and the pond's slow decay. He glanced at Anne. Something in his gaze asked whether they should document this detail or leave it be. Anne gave a tight nod, gesturing for Georgina to film. They all felt it. The quiet, heart-wrenching evidence of a day that ended too abruptly, of a place meant for laughter that never got to finish its story. Richard, watching from just behind them, shook his head at the breadth of destruction. He didn't voice it, but he was beginning to suspect the real explanation for the show's shutdown was far darker than the official line about licensing disputes. Back above, a flash of movement startled Tim. He swung around to see the light on the farmhouse porch flicker as if someone had passed in front of it. He dropped to a crouch by the fence, heart pounding. The radio crackled at his side, Georgina's voice, distant, warbled, reporting something about kids' stuff everywhere, but he could barely focus on her words. His attention was locked on that faint glow uphill. If the farmer was awake and decided to come out, they'd have practically no time to get the divers clear. A murmur of thunder sounded in the distance. Tim couldn't be sure if it was actual thunder or a truck rolling on a distant highway. The farmland around him was too dark to read. Every shape could be a tractor, a tree, or a silhouette of a man stepping closer. He felt sweat bead on his forehead despite the chill. A wave of helplessness washed over him. All he could do was crouch there, trying not to panic, waiting for the next sign of movement. Meanwhile, beneath the water, the 4 divers regrouped near the broken vacuum contraption. Anne and Richard exchanged a silent look of concern. They'd found evidence of children's presence, shoes, toys, tiny chairs, and that was deeply unsettling. Because for everything left behind, no records ever mentioned the presence of kids on that final day. No mention of families or visitors either. If children had been on set when it all ended, had they escaped before the flooding? Or had something else happened? The silt covering the decaying ruins suggested abrupt abandonment, as though everyone fled in a hurry. Georgina tried to calm the adrenaline creeping into her veins. This was what they'd come for, after all, to explore, to find out. But with every new discovery, the truth seemed colder and sharper than any rumor could convey. She thought about the child's shoe near the custard machine, the stuffed toys decaying under metal plating, and felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Another subtle tremor rolled through the water, turning the silt-laden current into a swirling haze. The custard machine's broken funnel trembled, as though giving a last rattling gasp. They all stayed very still, trying to sense if the pond floor itself was shifting or if something else moved below. It passed as quickly as it came. Richard motioned that they should keep moving. The group nodded, reluctant, yet compelled to push further. Whatever story had been silenced here, they were now entwined in its silent retelling. And with each wavering flashlight beam, they realized that every clue they found hinted at more than just a cancelled children's show. Something had gone very wrong here, long before the water rushed in. Anne took the lead again. Julian hovered at her side, hugging his arms tighter against the biting cold. Georgina lagged a moment to film one more angle of the abandoned vacuum and the tangle of hoses from the custard machine. The lens caught a half-melted sign posted near the machine, just a few letters still legible, bright cartoonish paint peeling away. Then she turned to follow, the water shifting around her in a low, steady surge that felt almost like a heartbeat. Above them, Tim flinched as the farmhouse light winked out. Nothing else moved, nothing but a deadening quiet stretching across the fields. He flicked his radio switch, voice trembling slightly. "Richard, guys, we might have company soon," he whispered. But there was no immediate reply, just a hissing static that refused to form words. He watched the horizon, scanning the blackness for the faint outline of a figure or the glint of a flashlight. Each passing second weighed heavier than the last, as though time itself was stalling, waiting for a collision between the living world above and the secrets entombed below. The current gently tugged them forwards. As Anne guided her light along what might have been a reinforced door, she saw the edges bent outward, as though something had hammered it from the other side. The metal was warped, rivets popped, the seal compromised. Richard joined her, tilting his head in silent astonishment at the battered seams. Georgina and Julian hovered close, beams of light dancing along the torn framework. Around the door's perimeter, they picked out carved glyphs, clusters of shapes that looked neither purely decorative nor entirely functional. Each was etched into a plate of metal, bolted onto the dome's exterior. Where the metal had peeled, those markings continued across the underlying fiberglass in hasty scrawls, as if someone had run out of time to do the job properly. Anne motioned for Georgina to film the symbols. The camera's glow revealed flaked paint surrounding each rune, faded, but once shockingly bright, perhaps part of some rushed attempt to seal or hide something. The closer Georgina zoomed in, the more the lines seemed crude and uneven. She recalled the rumors of a sudden set closure, the hush-hush flooding, the talk of containing a disaster. Now, it seemed, there was tangible evidence of that desperation. Julian eased closer to peer inside a small gap where the door no longer fit its frame. He noticed footprints in the silt, adult boot prints, and chillingly smaller ones that might have belonged to a child. Preserved by some fluke of sediment and still water, a jolt of dread passed through him at the idea of a last-minute scramble, children and adults side by side fleeing in panic. He signaled Anne to shine her torch deeper inside. A haze of drifting muck illuminated what had once been a corridor, strewn with twisted scaffolding and remnants of harnesses dangling from overhead bars. Tattered cables hung from the ceiling like underwater vines. At the far end, something large and metallic glimmered beneath the silt, perhaps a hatch or gate, partially pried open. More glyphs adorned its edges, thicker, repeated in red paint that had run in watery streaks. Julian felt his pulse hammer. The place had the atmosphere of a desperate last stand rather than a TV set. Richard cautiously pressed his hand to the door, testing if it would give. It shifted with a rasping groan, dislodging flakes of corroded metal and stirring clouds of sediment. Anne grabbed Julian's arm, fearing a sudden collapse, but the door stayed firm. Richard swept his light across the corridor again, revealing half-submerged crates stacked against the walls. Some bore stenciled warnings, hazmat or bio. Others lay smashed, their contents scattered or missing. Georgina drifted near, camera always rolling, and glimpsed a sign pinned askew to the wall. She leaned in, wiping at the algae to reveal fragments of text. Emergency protocol. Evacuation. Containment failure. Her heart beat faster. This wasn't a simple abandoned show set. Some real crisis had taken place here. She signaled to Richard, who nodded grimly. Meanwhile, at the pond's surface, Tim flinched at static crackling over his radio. He jammed it to his ear, discerning half-words, someone calling out names, or maybe just a spike of garbled noise. The farmland around him stood silent, every shadow a potential figure creeping closer. The farmhouse lamp remained off, and that lack of activity worried him more than if he'd seen someone pacing by a window. The hush felt like the quiet before a storm, where every instinct screamed that something was imminent. Below, the divers maneuvered into the corridor, each step sending silt billowing around their ankles. The walls bore scars of more than water damage. Deep gouges ran parallel, as though from repeated blows or from something raking the metal in frenzied violence. Loose lengths of dented piping dangled overhead, half torn from the ceiling. If there had been children here at the end, the terror must have been unimaginable. They advanced to the partially pried hatch at the corridor's end. The glyphs near it looked more intense, layered on top of older markings, the paint bleeding in tangled loops and harsh strokes. Julian's light panned across these desperate signs. He couldn't shake the impression that they'd been reapplied multiple times, each attempt more frantic than the last. Richard crouched to inspect the floor near the hatch. A vent ran beneath, blocked by boards and twisted rebar. Shining his flashlight revealed scraps of bright material, costume fabric perhaps, clinging to the broken metal. A single adult-sized shoe rested partway down the vent, mired in silt. For an instant he thought he saw eyes reflecting back from the darkness, only to realize it was a shard of glossy plastic. Nonetheless, the hair on his arms prickled. Georgina held the camera steady, capturing every detail of the hatch. The thick, battered door looked as if it had been forced outward from inside. She touched the largest glyph with a gloved hand. Through the paint, she felt pitted metal, as if it had been scorched or corroded. A faint tremor shuddered through her hand. A trick of the imagination, maybe, or some resonance left in the metal from that final attempt to seal away whatever lay beyond. Anne cast a glance at an instruction plaque stenciled overhead. Seal portal. Maintain coolant. Do not open. The last words were smeared by what could have been oil or something darker. She swallowed hard. Clearly, the people here had been fighting something more than a simple production mishap. Another tremor passed through the water, turning silt into a swirling curtain around their lights. Georgina snapped her head around, shining the camera's beam toward the darkness. Nothing. And yet the entire corridor seemed to groan. Just then, a dull metal clang echoed from the center of the dome's floor, as if something deep within had shifted. Julian twisted in place, trying to identify the source, when a sudden creak cut through the water, a long metallic howl that reverberated in the enclosed space. With a jolt, they saw a seam in the corridor's central floor begin to separate. It started as a hairline gap, water rushing into the opening in a slow, sucking vortex. The swirl tugged at their ankles, drawing silt and debris down into a hidden chamber below. Their flashlights caught a glimpse of massive hinges that had been corroded shut, but now shuddered under the shifting pressure. An ancient mechanism, forced by the water's weight or by their presence, was giving way. The gap widened, and a new current formed, stronger and more insistent. Richard snatched at a handhold on a jagged piece of scaffolding, gesturing wildly for the others to do the same. The flow roared with increasing volume, pulling silt, crates, and loose debris down into the dark. Anne fought to anchor herself, struggling to kick away from the widening rift. Georgina, camera pressed to her chest, tried to grasp a metal beam protruding from the corridor ceiling. Her eyes darted to Julian, who'd been closer to the seam. She saw him flailing against the force, his flashlight spinning wildly as the current threatened to yank him in. Georgina shoved the camera into a belt loop and lunged, wrapping an arm around Julian's torso. She slammed her dive fins against the floor, hoping for friction, but the swirling water plowed them both forward a few more feet. The hatch and glyphs glowed in the jittering torch beams, the ancient paint now nearly obscured by sediment whipped into a frenzied storm. Anne managed to grab a pipe jutting from the ceiling, knuckles white under her gloves. She signaled to Richard in rapid gestures, urging them to retreat. But a wave of water surged again, as if the chamber below were breathing in, intensifying the drag. Torn scraps of harnesses and old cables slithered overhead like serpents caught in a whirlpool. The corridor lights flickered in time with their panicked breathing. Richard gritted his teeth, hooking a wrist through a twisted bracket. His free hand clamped onto Georgina's shoulder, steadying her as she struggled to hold onto Julian. The floor under them groaned, metal scraping metal, and the seam opened another inch. A barrage of silt and debris poured into the new gap, rattling against hidden machinery below. The noise vibrated in their chests, drowning out the rhythmic hiss of their regulators. The four divers found themselves in a desperate fight against the current. Julian coughed water into his regulator, fear blooming in his chest as he saw the corridor's walls start to buckle. Every muscle ached, adrenaline spiking as he tried to kick backward. Georgina dug her heels into the silt, her mind racing with the horrific thought of being sucked into some buried vault where only the darkness remained. Above them, Tim's radio crackled incessantly. He paced by the pond's edge, frantically calling for a status update. The dark farmland offered no comfort. He glimpsed what might have been a shape moving near the barn, but it was gone too quickly to be sure. Another burst of static came through the speaker, just faint enough to be maddening. Get out. Flow. Strong. He couldn't make sense of it. His stomach twisted. Something was going wrong down there, and there was nothing he could do but watch the still water and pray they'd resurface in one piece. Down below, the metal seam continued to yawn wider. The old containment door within the corridor's floor, reacting to a chain of events nobody fully understood. Another surge came, and for a moment Georgina slipped. Her fingers began to lose their grip on the bracket. Julian braced his foot against a broken crate, pushing back with all his might. Anne, locked onto a pipe, managed to wedge her knee behind a snapped beam, creating a makeshift anchor point. Then, as suddenly as it intensified, the current slackened, just enough for them to drag themselves backward, away from the gap. The roaring draw lessened into a steady swirl, water churning with bits of plastic foam and silt. Hearts hammering, they stared at one another with wide, terrified eyes. No one needed to speak to confirm what had just happened. The pond had concealed more than old props, more than tragic remains. There was a mechanism at its heart, a chamber intended to house something dreadful, and the years had not rendered it harmless. Instead, the battered structure was failing, and the water had begun the process of dragging everything within its domain into that unknown, entombed place. Richard inhaled shakily through his regulator, glancing back at the corridor. Mud and debris still swirled around the seam. It wasn't done opening, and he didn't want to be anywhere near it when the full force let loose. He patted Georgina on the shoulder, letting his hand linger to confirm she was okay. She nodded, unable to hide the terror in her eyes. Anne waved them toward the shallower end, back towards the ruined dome's entry. They'd seen all they needed to see, enough to understand that the final moments here had been a frantic struggle to contain something dark and terrible. Now that dark something was stirring again, and the fracturing dome would soon allow whatever lay below to taste freedom once more. Richard had just begun to guide Georgina and Julian toward the exit when a sudden metallic shriek echoed through the flooded corridor. The seam in the floor buckled anew, twisting apart with a jarring snap. Water whipped into a violent funnel, churning debris in a furious spiral. Before any of them could react, the current seized their legs, ripping at their fins and propelling them backward. Anne clung to the doorframe, her regulator releasing panicked bubbles as she tried to brace for them, but Richard felt his grip on the corroded bracket slip. He watched in horror as Julian and Georgina careened helplessly into the widening rift, their lights spinning in a frantic kaleidoscope of silt and broken metal. A deafening groan, and the last frail support of the corridor floor tore free with a thunderous roar. An unstoppable vortex dragged everything toward that yawning void below. Anne's fingers clawed at an overhead cable, her body jerking painfully from the force, but it wasn't enough. One by one, the divers lost their tenuous holds and vanished into the ravenous dark. The water crushed every sound into an eerie roar, leaving only a wild chaos of shifting shadows, flailing limbs, and swirling debris. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the corridor fell into blackness. The derelict dome and its desperate glyphs receded into the gloom, and the four explorers hurtled downward into a place that should forever have remained sealed. Tim stood by the drooping fence, head lowered, listening for any sound from below the pond's surface. He thought he'd heard a distant clang or shout moments ago, but now the night was silent. A heavy sky pressed down, starless and pitch. Even the farmhouse on the distant rise, once a point of anxious observation, seemed to have vanished into the void. He inhaled a trembling breath, feeling the weight of emptiness. The radio battery blinked low. Nothing but a faint hiss answered his repeated calls to Richard, to Georgina, to any of them. He'd been the lookout, the one who should warn them if the landowner appeared. He never expected the real danger would come from under the water's surface. A creeping dread told him his friends were in trouble, but there was no one to turn to. When it happened, he didn't register the footsteps, just sensed a shift in the air. Then a hand clamped over his mouth from behind, an arm looping across his chest. He buckled, heart exploding in raw panic, only to be lifted upright by a strength that felt impossibly precise. No wasted motion, no grunts of effort. The radio tumbled from his grasp and disappeared in the wet grass. "Quiet!" A voice hissed near his ear. It was calm, unnervingly so, like a warning pitched low so only Tim would hear. He froze, pulse thundering. In the dim light, he glimpsed a man in dark gear, face half concealed by a tactical hood and goggles. A rifle was slung across the man's torso, muzzle down, but Tim knew in a heartbeat it could swing up in an instant. There was nothing of a simple farmer's shuffle or uncertain anger. This was practiced, coiled, ready for far worse than trespassers with cameras. Tim tried to speak, but the arm stiffened, pressing air from his lungs. Then, just as swiftly, the grip eased. The man released him, stepping back, watchful. The silhouette was taller than he'd guessed, all angles and hidden hardware. Strapped pouches, a comm unit looped near one shoulder, boots that tread silently over drenched soil. No part of him suggested farmland or fence mending. This was a sentinel, a soldier. A distant roar snapped Tim's attention back to the pond. The water had begun to move, swirling in the center as if circling a drain. Mud and reeds slid inward, drawn by a rising current that kicked up an eerie, sucking sound. In the gloom, it looked like the pond was exhaling and inhaling all at once. Tim staggered forward, hands gripping the chain-link fence for balance, and the armed stranger followed, boots whisper quiet on the sodden ground. Another tremor rattled the earth, more forceful this time. The water collapsed inward, forming a wild vortex. Tim half cried out, searching the churning surface for any sign of flashlights, gear, anything that might indicate the diver's survival. But there was nothing. A thunderous crack echoed, and he watched, sickened, as the pond's perimeter caved. Silt and algae poured into the vortex, carrying bits of old equipment that broke the surface in fleeting glimpses. Something metallic rolled past, maybe a dive tank or a broken prop. Then it vanished beneath a surge of foam. He stumbled away from the fence, nearly colliding with the man, who guided him with a surprisingly gentle push towards safer ground. Tim's breath came in quick, panicked bursts. In a matter of minutes, the pond drained with terrifying speed. Mucky water churned down into an unseen cavity. When the worst of the clamor subsided, Tim realized he could see the pond's exposed floor, sodden earth, lumps of half-rotted fiberglass, twisted beams. He wanted to scream for his friends, to demand some explanation, but his voice snagged in his throat. All at once the swirling ceased. The last of the water gurgled away, leaving a wide crater ringed by a slope of shifting mud. At its center stood a dome, looming in the sudden hush. Streams of filthy water dripped down its sides, revealing battered metal plates scrawled with symbols Tim couldn't begin to read. A breach near the dome's base gaped open like a wound, edges warped and caked in black sludge. Tim forced himself a step closer, his limbs trembling. The soldier moved in tandem, scanning the scene with the barrel of his rifle angled low. Lightning flickered overhead, illuminating the structure in stark contrast. For a beat, the night's gloom peeled back, showing Tim just how large and broken the dome truly was. The glyphs carved or painted around that opening suggested a frantic, desperate job. The soldier inhaled sharply, as though to say something, then stayed silent. He pressed a hand to the comm unit near his collar, listened, and let out a barely audible sigh. No backup, no second line. Nothing but a swirl of night air carrying the stench of rot from the crater. Tim glimpsed the soldier's face in another bolt of lightning, older than he'd first guessed, jaw clenched, eyes reflecting the dome's wet sheen with a flicker of dread. And yet there was composure, a deadly readiness. He was rattled but not paralyzed, unlike Tim, whose chest felt ready to collapse. Rain began to patter, soft at first. The dome gleamed under the droplets, each rivulet tracing a path down battered plating. Tim tried to form a question, "Can you help them?" But the words wouldn't come. All he managed was a ragged gasp. The soldier lowered the rifle, stepping to the crater's edge. Thick ribbons of mud sloughed off, revealing more segments of the hidden structure. Tim noticed what looked like rebar supports twisted into impossible angles, the reek of algae mixing with stale chemicals. At the dome's base, that gaping mouth yawned deeper than he cared to imagine. A dull hum seemed to vibrate the air, or maybe it was just the echo of his heart thudding in his ears. A part of Tim wanted to bolt for the van, to tear away from this place and its black secrets. Another part knew he couldn't leave the others, even if hope seemed non-existent. He took a halting step forward, but the soldier's gloved hand pressed against his shoulder, a silent command to stay put. Tim's knees gave a little, a sob scraping his throat. He could still see the swirl of the water as it crashed down on them. If they were alive, how could they escape now? If they weren't. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears mingling with rain on his cheeks. The soldier's stance shifted, weight balanced, scanning the perimeter with the calm of someone used to intercepting threats. The battered dome loomed large, the final resting place of something that had never been meant to see the light again. Thunder rumbled, distant but threatening, and the night itself felt poised on the verge of collapse. In the next flash of lightning, Tim caught the soldier's profile turned to him, an expression that might have been pity or frustration. Neither spoke. The soldier's gear told a story of specialized experience, but nothing in that training could quiet the raw dread emanating from the crater. As the rain continued, the soldier drew Tim back from the edge. Mud slid in clumps down the slope, the dome now fully revealed under the open sky. Tim tried once more to speak, to blame himself, to ask for help, but the soldier merely shook his head, an unspoken, "It's done." They both stared at the structure, silent, empty, yet somehow alive with possibility. Lightning carved a final arc across the clouds, illuminating the dome in stark detail. Battered doors half open, glyphs trailing water, a darkness within that seemed to pulse. Tim let out a small, broken whimper. The soldier inhaled, shoulders straightening, as though forcing composure. A quiet dread settled between them. No rescue lights flared on the horizon, no cavalry, no sirens. They stood there for a long moment, the soldier scanning the building with the rifle readied, Tim shaking so hard he could barely stop his teeth chattering. The sense of a final boundary crossed weighed on them both. A new rumble rose from the crater, a reverberation that made the dome's walls groan. Tim staggered backward, half expecting the entire structure to collapse or split wide. It didn't, but the hush that followed was worse than any explosion. It spoke of a deeper presence, something that, freed from its watery prison, might soon reach out from the abyss. Raindrops spattered on their shoulders. Slowly, Tim fell to his knees in the mud, tears mingling with the downpour. The soldier remained standing, but Tim sensed his composure was a thin veneer over deep turmoil. Darkness swallowed the farmland again, a suffocating black that made the distant tree line and sagging fences dissolve into formless shadows. The soldier stood rigid, eyes fixed on the dome, as if every nightmare he'd ever prepared for had taken shape in front of him. He drew a breath, but it caught in his throat. Despite all the gear strapped to his body, despite every sign of discipline in his posture, a shudder ran through him like a ripple of dread he couldn't contain. Tim watched that tremor and felt his own terror magnify, because here was a man clearly trained for violence and crisis, yet even he seemed momentarily undone. A single low rumble rolled through the earth, and the soldier finally tore his gaze from the dome. He turned on Tim, and for an instant his composure cracked, eyes wide with an almost pleading urgency. "God," he whispered, half to himself, half to Tim, "you have no idea what you've unleashed here." His voice shook just enough to betray the fear beneath. Tim tried to stammer an apology, to say they hadn't known, but the soldier cut him off with a short, desperate gesture. Another crash of thunder drowned out whatever he might have added. The farmland around them felt alive in its silence, a vast animal crouching in the dark. Nothing moved but the rain and the drips of muddy water coursing down the dome. Tim and the soldier stood there like two lost men, awaiting a storm far greater than any weather, one that had already begun, somewhere deep below their feet. The night refused to offer any answers. Lightning flickered and was gone. In the gathering gloom, Tim and the soldier remained, silhouettes against the raw wound of earth. The dome shone in watery reflection, a monument to old secrets that refused to die quietly. Silent, complicit, waiting for the horror within to break its final seal.
The wind shook them to the Teletubbies.
So that's where our signal falls silent. Tim, drenched and terrified, the pond-turned crater still dripping around that dome, sealed off, flooded in a hurry, and now guarded by a man who moves like special forces and carries hardware meant for far more than a trespasser or two. The biggest questions aren't just what lies beneath those battered metal plates, but why anyone would bury a studio set under so much secrecy. and who keeps watch in the darkness to make sure it stays that way. I can't claim to know the whole story, but this much is clear. Whatever they uncovered wasn't meant to see daylight again. And just like that, our signal cuts out, leaving no rescue, no answers, just a looming certainty that Tim and his friends stumbled into something far darker than an old kid's TV set. But for now, the broadcast is gone. Fear not, however, if the next trace of this mystery hits our frequencies, I'll be here, sifting through the static. Something tells me this tale isn't yet finished, so stay alert, because sometimes the echoes of a buried truth have a way of surfacing again when you least expect it.